Ever since the Final Fantasy series first graced the NES in 1987, the world has slowly acknowledged video games as an art form. But nowadays, games stand at a crossroads between making meaningful statements and maintaining wide appeal. Some recent games have struggled to toe the line between games' artistic and financial ambitions, and we'll be looking at some today. First up, insisting that The Division 2 isn't divisive. The green poison has become a global pandemic, devastating countries all over the world. Governments couldn't respond to the crisis fast enough, and society as we know it has begun to fall. Washington has been evacuated. The president seems to be dead, and the government of the United States is no more. The only group that survived the fall of the White House is the Strategic Homeland Division, whose agents have been activated and tasked with restoring order to Washington. But the pandemic has not stopped, and the collapse has gone too far. Is there any order left to restore? Anyone who reads that synopsis of 2018's sleeper, The Division 2, would interpret this as a story about current events and a contemporary on the fragility of the society that we've built for ourselves. Gamers were interested in what the developers had to say about America and democracy, and although the game came out back in 2018, a certain pandemic in the real world would eventually make its setting prescient. And yet, publisher Ubisoft insisted that The Division 2 is just harmless fun. In an interview with Polygon, creative lead Terry Spire insisted on framing the premise of the game as being one where players just walked into a bad situation and now they have to fix it. He played off the game's blatant political imagery and messaging as just the game's aesthetic. The message was this: The Division 2 isn't controversial. Don't let your politics stop you from playing. Does The Division 2 actually make a political statement? That's a matter of opinion and analysis, but it's also beside the point of this piece. We're more interested in Spire and Ubisoft's efforts to sway people's perception of the game, and why this is becoming increasingly common in the world of AAA games. Next, Wolfenstein 2, The New Colossus causes new headaches. Just the previous year, another game by a major publisher tried the opposite approach in its marketing and ended up starting a bit of a firestorm. The game in question was Wolfenstein 2, The New Colossus, and its publisher was Bethesda, a pound-for-pound competitor to Ubisoft. This reboot series of Wolfenstein had a pretty controversial setting from the start. It takes place in a world where the Nazis won World War II and have completely subjugated the world. That being said, it's not a serious story by any means. The protagonist is often referred to by his initials, BJ. Throughout the game's marketing, Bethesda made light of the fact that after all this time, we're back to committing horrible acts of violence on the Nazis, which used to be tradition in video games. You would hardly expect this to even be considered a political statement. Unfortunately, over the 2010s, the political alt-right gained a stronger foothold on the internet, and given their Nazi sympathies, much bellyaching occurred over this marketing. Comment sections were engulfed in wars over whether it was appropriate to be mean to the Nazis. When trolls and bots were added to the mix, the discourse around this game soured even further. The gaming world learned that Hitler had lost his status as a black and white villain, and a cheesy game about killing Nazis was now seen as political commentary. The New Colossus, which was a major release at the time, was only ever followed up by 2 mini spin-offs in 2019, and there's no indication that there will be a proper follow-up. Is it because of something mundane like commercial performance? Or could it be that this series has exposed a darkness at heart of the video game world? And now for proving the relationship between games and politics. Examples like that of Wolfenstein may discourage publishers from acknowledging the politics that drive their games, but as was the case in The Division 2, the political elements are often clearly visible. Just saying something doesn't exist doesn't make it so. After all, it can be argued that any video game that has a narrative is political. Let's try to prove that point by taking a look at 2 games that even the most gamers would think are apolitical, and try to break down the undertones that lurk beneath their surface. Exhibit A, Call of Duty. Starting with a pretty cliche example, Call of Duty. Though this series is best known for its multiplayer, almost every game besides Black Ops 3 did have a single-player campaign. While the stories of those campaigns varied from entry to entry, it was always about some war or the other. The World War II games put you in the boots of various soldiers in various theaters of the war, but always on the side of the Allies. Meanwhile, the Modern Warfare line saw you playing as SAS agents and US military troops combating terrorist forces in the Middle East and beyond. We don't think of Call of Duty being a political series at all, but that might be because being anti-terrorist or anti-Nazi isn't usually a stance worth even talking about. However, Wolfenstein has proven that being anti-Nazi is controversial to some people, and critics have been pointing out for years that anti-terrorism can be a convenient vector for pro-American imperialist ideas. If you hadn't given this much thought before, you don't have to start now. Call of Duty honestly seems to end up taking these stances by accident. The point is that any game that tells a story has an ideology. But remember, their stories that promote American imperialism, or whatever, aren't the main focus of the games, and the multiplayer certainly places players on an equal footing. Exhibit B, Sid Meier's Civilization. But let's look at an even more esoteric case, Sid Meier's Civilization. In its full form, this is a game in which players start at the common point in human ancestry, the caveman years. From there, players must work through a tech tree to develop basic things like the wheel and the concept of writing while spreading out across the land to build new cities. Eventually coming the time when you'll develop your society, and it can be any society you want, or can it? There's a word for when you expand across lands and integrate them into your own empire, kinda rhymes with cereal, and it's really only the game that tells you these lands are untouched and yours for the taking. We never get to hear what the indigenous peoples of those lands have to say about you establishing your rule and exploiting their ancestral lands for resources. We've figured out the word. By the way, it's imperial. That's okay, to be honest, we love ourselves some Civ, but we do have to point out that this game doesn't let you build a civilization on your own terms. The arc of the game does ultimately reflect the fact that Sid Meier is from Canada, and these games follow a very Western idea of Civ building that could very well be interpreted as a political stance. Next, being political is not bad. From books to music to movies, art and politics go hand in hand. Sometimes the politics are subtle, other times you end up with a book like 1984, portending a grim future for the human race. One thing is clear though, the artists who work in those mediums treasure the right to make whatever kind of art they like. Green Day is currently making dad rock, but they also make American Idiot and define the political sensibilities of a generation. Alan Moore has written Swamp Thing and Superman comics, but he also wrote the highly charged Watchmen and V for Vendetta. The video game industry had a long run to being recognized as an art form, and a longer road still to showcase challenging situations and ask the hard questions. It's a shame that now video games, with all the artistic freedom that they could ask for, are being held back by the industry itself. Should video games avoid politics? If you really wanted to strip politics from games, you could do that, but you'd only ever end up with something like Mario. He's basically the only true political neutral in modern games. His old competitor Sonic the Hedgehog probably has political undertones that you could see if you squinted hard enough. Mario has his place, and a well-deserved one, but gamers do ask for more from their games. We think that every gamer should have the kind of games they want. Those who genuinely want politics to stay out of games should be able to find their games of choice, and those who want games to challenge them should have the games they'd like. Let's look again at Wolfenstein. They accidentally stepped on the toes of the right wing, but what was the consequence? A segment of people on the internet got angry? Books have been burned for their objectionable content, but no one has ever suggested curtailing the artistic freedom of authors. China refuses to play Marvel movies in their cinemas, but Disney of all companies is sticking to their guns. We believe that video game publishers should stand by the games they're publishing and be willing to take a hit to their bottom line in the name of advancing video games as an art form. And that ends our deep dive into video games and politics. What do you think about video games as a form of expression? Light up the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.